Welcome to Heritage at Home, the series where we discuss history, heritage, and all things digital. My name's Bess Rhodes, and today we're going to be thinking about the medieval residence of the Lords of the Isles at Finlaggan on Islay. We were really privileged last year to work on a reconstruction of what Finlaggan might have looked like in the Middle Ages with the amazing Finlaggan Trust who care for the site. To discuss Finlaggan and the Lordship of the Isles in the Middle Ages and the wider history of Islay, we've got a really distinguished panel with us today. We're delighted to have with us Dr. David Caldwell, who led the archaeological excavations at Finlaggan, and who's also the author of Islay, the Land of the Lordship. Hello, David.
Hello everybody. It's great to be here.
So glad you could join us. We've also got, coming from all the way across the Atlantic, we've got Dr. Andrew MacDonald, who's author of The Kingdom of the Isles, Scotland's Western Seaboard, and who I believe has a new publication coming out, The Sea Kings, the Late Norse Kingdoms of Man and the Isles. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. And we're also delighted to have Dr. Alan McNiven with us. Alan's the author of The Vikings in Islay, the place of names in Hebridean settlement history. And Alan's also been doing a really interesting digital project down at Edinburgh on the Islay Cultural Database, which I think we'll be hearing a bit more about later. So Alan, welcome as well.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be back in Islay, even if it is only virtually.
Absolutely. We're all from different parts of the country right now, but all got this strong interest in Islay and what a beautiful, beautiful spot it is and such amazing history. And also delighted to have with us my colleagues from the Open Virtual Worlds team in St Andrews, Dr. Alan Miller and Dr. Ian Oliver. So it's great to have the group here today. Thank you for joining us. As ever, if you've got questions, we'll have Q&A at the end, and please do sort of suggest things on Facebook as we're going through. But first, let's discover a bit about medieval Finlaggan and why it mattered. Ian, I think we've got a little video clip of the reconstruction of what Finlaggan might have looked like in about the 15th century. And David, while we're looking at the video, would you be able to maybe tell us a little bit about why Finlaggan's a significant place?
Yes, indeed. It was the centre of a major lordship in the medieval period under the Lords of the Isles, who were the MacDonalds. And although we call them lords in Gaelic and Irish society, these people had the status of kings. They, at a time when military might was really important, the lords could put several thousand warriors in ships and send them to fight on the mainland or in Ireland. And in medieval times, that was real power. And what's more, they were patrons of Gaelic society. They had their own way of life. And this is a strand which underlies so much of our image of being Scottish. And I think it's very, very important that we have an understanding of this, and that Finlaggan is a centre, is a place where so much of this originated or happened on a beautiful island of Islay.
I mean, it's really fascinating because it's a place which is so important for understanding the Western Isles, but as you say, it's maybe got this wider significance for Scottish culture, although its relationship with the Scottish kings might on occasions have been a bit tense, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in a second. So here you are, as you can see from the video, it was an island residence. There's the island of Islay, but Finlaggan itself was located on a loch within the island. So there's a lot of water involved, and I think we might be coming back to that in a second. So it's really fantastic. It's this really interesting place which is important for the Lordship of the Isles. But I think there's a really interesting story about how does Islay come to be significant and sort of its wider political role. I think, Ian, we've got a map of where Islay is in relation to some other places nearby. And Andrew, could you maybe tell us a bit about sort of the political importance of Islay? How does Islay come to be an important place?
I would be absolutely delighted to say a few things about that. And I think the place to start with this is to rewind to a time in the Middle Ages when Islay was really at the center of things. It was at a vital strategic geographic crossroads within the context of the Isles and indeed the sort of broader North Atlantic world. So one thing we need to try to do is to rewind our imaginations to imagine a sort of an Islay-centric world in this period. And in fact, the significance of Islay really doesn't begin in the period of the lordship. It extends much earlier. So as early as the end of the 11th century, Islay formed part of the Isle of Man-based Kingdom of the Isles. And while we don't know very much about Islay in the 11th century, there are hints that it held quite an important position in that Kingdom of the Isles. In fact, Godred Crovan, who was the warlord that founded the kingdom, actually died on Islay in 1095. That's one of those hints. Then in the middle of the 12th century, in the 1150s, when that Kingdom of the Isles broke into two parts, and Somerled, who was a powerful warlord, probably originating in Argyll, sort of pulled some of the islands out of the control of the Manx kings. Islay was one of those islands, and it took on a new role in that second Kingdom of the Isles that was ruled by Somerled and his descendants. And of course, one of those descendants was his grandson Donald, who was the eponym and the ancestor of the MacDonald Lords of the Isles of the later Middle Ages. I'm pretty sure we'll hear more about them later on. And then, of course, Islay continues that important role into the period of the lordship from the early 14th until the end of the 15th century, when it really comes into its own as the major power center, the sort of jewel in the crown of the MacDonald power centers in the period. And just to conclude with one quick comment, we've mentioned already, we've heard already the importance of the water and the seaways. And the point I think that's really crucial to understand these kingdoms and lordships is to understand that they're medieval water worlds, that they comprise islands and locks and channels and straits and bits of mainland shore. And we need to really be thinking in a perspective that emphasizes that maritime aspect. And that is sort of what puts Islay in the center of this map.
Absolutely. I think you see from the map we've had on the screen the way in which sort of these are places which have got water all around them, connecting them very much, isn't it? Andrew, thank you so much for giving us an overview of the sort of evolving nature of the political structures in the islands. So we get to this point in the late Middle Ages where Islay is really important and Fnaga is really important. It's at the heart of the Lordship of the Isles, this semi-autonomous area of the Western Scotland. However, things don't necessarily work out perfectly for the MacDonald Lords of the Isles. David, could you tell us a bit about sort of what goes wrong for them and why today Finlaggan sort of is in ruins? And Ian, while we're doing that, maybe we could sort of see some pictures of what Finlaggan's like today, while David's telling us about what happened to the Lords of the Isles.
Right, okay. Well, the MacDonalds were, in the view of the kings of Scotland, overmighty. They were people who wanted to go their own way. To some extent, they were rivals of the Stuarts for control of large parts of the country. They were troublesome. They were prepared to send out armies to fight royal armies. They took blackmail in large parts of Scotland and just basically did not play a major role on behalf of the crown as regional magnates. And inevitably, Scottish kings got a bit fed up with this. And King James IV, was determined to put them down, to take away their power. And finally, John II, Lord of the Isles, was forfeited in 1493. And although there were several attempts after that to find a successor to be Lord of the Isles, the MacDonalds never ever managed to establish a unified power again in the West. And sometime, perhaps in the late 1490s, some of the main MacDonald leaders were captured at Finlaggan and taken back to Edinburgh, and they were executed. And it was very probably at that time that the island and its main buildings were systematically dismantled. That's what the archaeological excavations seem to show, is that buildings were taken apart and destroyed. And it's almost as if King James back in Edinburgh said to his agents, look, I don't want any more nonsense from these people over in the West. I want to make sure you flatten that site and it's never, ever again a centre of power or a place where people can gather in opposition to me. And so the end of Finlaggan was quite dramatic, and about in the 1490s. And it's only in later periods that it was turned into a relatively minor farming township.
It is amazing, the story of how it evolves, and sort of that very sort of the way, a very influential, very powerful group of people, the way their power structures could collapse so suddenly when they came into contact with another rather powerful group of people within Scotland. That is fantastic. David, thank you so much for giving us an overview of why Finlaggan is ruined today and sort of what's happened to the Lordship of the Isles. Now, we've been really, really privileged to work on a reconstruction of, would partly informed by your research, David, but also with some imagination as well, of what Finlaggan might have looked like in the 15th century. Ian, do you have that reconstruction ready to go? Because it'd be nice to sort of explore it with the great panel that we've got and the wonderful insights we've got here. Brilliant, fantastic. So we are now standing in our reconstruction of what we think Finlaggan and its surroundings might have looked like in the 15th century, when the Lords of the Isles were very much at the height of their influence. Now, Alan, could you maybe give us a bit of context on sort of the background, sort of the economy, the things that are sustaining the Lords of the Isles? We're coming down towards the mill here. Could you maybe give us some context and background on what's sustaining the Lords of the Isles and how they're interacting with the wider economy and things?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So we've heard from Andrew how important the location of Islay was as a strategic node in communications network. But another reason why Islay was so important for the Lords of the Isles was its relative fertility. And we're looking down now southwards through the top end of the Sorn Valley. We can see the rolling hills, the lush pasture lands, some arable fields there, supporting what is almost exclusively a rural agricultural community. Now, in the Middle Ages, and until quite recently, there was nothing approaching a free market economy. Most goods were produced and consumed very, very locally. And the object of production, it's interesting to note, wasn't necessarily the acquisition of cash money. So we can look at an extract from the Rental of the Lordship of the Isles from 1541 here. And it tells us that for a farm with an extent of 1 quarter, which despite the name was actually a very big farm, and that's the size of the farm we're looking at now. So Portanelan, which was the previous name for Finlaggan there. The people who rented that land would be paying the lords 10 shillings in cash, but that really wasn't so important. Over and above that, they had to render 4 beef cattle, 30 stones of cheese, 4 castrated rams, 4 geese, 4 hens, and 30 stones of meal. And I suppose that's poignant. We're looking here at a reconstruction of an early historic stroke prehistoric mill. And the production of grain, the grinding of grain into flour and the baking of bread were very, very important. For the people who lived on Eilean Mor, and we'll learn more about those shortly, It wasn't just the reception of the rent that was important, it was the conspicuous consumption of the goods that were produced. So something that's really difficult for us to imagine nowadays is just how heavily the threat of starvation, of famine, was hanging over the heads of the wider population. They never knew from one year to the next if they'd have enough to eat. And if they didn't, death was almost inevitable. For the lords, for the people who owned the land, one of their duties, one of their responsibilities was to ensure that their supporters were fed, but they also symbolized the importance of food. So these were people who not only had enough to eat, they were people who could eat as much as they liked. And this concept underpins the other ideas, which we'll see more about shortly, of the hall culture, which was shared commonly across certainly Northern Europe in the Middle Ages, and the conspicuous consumption of food and drink and alcohol in feasts.
That's it, absolutely. I think it's really important to remember that this is a community that is quite a special community we're seeing on these two islands. So we're coming down in the reconstruction towards Ellen More, or the sort of large islands. There's sort of the settlements. There are things on the land surrounding the loch, but the real focal point is these two islands. We're on the large island now. So shall we stop in this area actually, because we're near to quite an important building and quite an important point on the island. We're near the chapel, which still actually you can see little bits of to this day. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about sort of the history of Christianity in Islay, and maybe also could you maybe tell us, Alan, a little bit about the name Finlaggan and how we come to have this name?
Yeah, certainly. Well, we can start with the name. It's like most ancient place names, it's open to interpretation, but the most commonly accepted view is the name Finlaggan is a contraction, and it refers to the Celtic saint Findlug. So the old name for the farm on shore was Port Aneilan, so the landing place or the port of Saint Findlug. So this island, or probably originally a chapel on it, was dedicated to an ancient and for us now long forgotten saint. And that ties the area in with Christianity, early Christianity. Now, the reconstruction of the chapel we can see here dates to a relatively late period. So we're talking about the later Middle Ages. There are indications that Islay was a thoroughly Christian community right from the beginning of the production of historical records, as a central part of the early Gaelic-speaking kingdom of Dalriada. Islay was thoroughly imbued with the tenets and the outlook of early medieval Christianity. There is a fairly good chance that some of those tenets were forgotten or swept away, at least for a while, during the period we now know as the Viking Age. But eventually, even the Viking settlers on Islay would have accepted the light of the Lord and become Christians, although possibly not for reasons of moral redemption, but as my medieval historian colleagues can tell you here, for reasons of making their control of the populace more complete and easier to manage. So we see, really, as soon as records start being produced, evidence of landowners and especially lords building and funding the supply of chapels on their property. And this is certainly the case here. And this is quite an impressive stone-built chapel. There's good evidence that early reflexes of Christianity in the Isles would have taken place in the open air or from the open doors of very small buildings. This is a relatively big building made from stone, which many people could have fit into. So this is a display of power, of wealth, of authority, as well as a dedication to spiritual.
Yeah, actually, in relation to that outdoors possible sort of associations and things, we have got an outdoor marker, haven't we? If we go around to the right a bit, can we, or maybe the left, we can see, yes, we can see the stone cross outside, which we'll come back to later, but which is of significance. Okay, thank you so much, that lovely overview and sort of the layering of the history really in this area. And I think very important to remember, we've chosen to represent one moment in Finlaggan's story, but there's an awful lot which lays before the time period we've represented. Shall we move on into the island? So there's a lot of buildings on this area. It's crowded. There's a lot going on. And if we move up the island, we move up towards a really interesting building. We move up towards the Great Hall. As we're approaching the Great Hall, David, could you maybe tell us a bit about the significance of this, and also sort of the wider culture that surrounded the hall, and sort of maybe some of the luxuries and things that may be associated?
Yeah, of course. There was probably at least 20 buildings at any one time on this island. And when you were approaching it from up or down the loch side, the Great Hall would have been the obvious building that you'd have seen, the largest structure there. And it was quite an impressive building. It had a slate roof, it had stone dressings. And when you got inside, there was a timber floor. There were probably hangings round the wall. And you'll note that in this reconstruction, you put up tartan hangings, which may be a surprise to some people who tend to think of tartan as being very much a sort of Victorian phenomenon. But what we do know is that the production of cloth, which was very probably tartan, was very important on Islay in the medieval period. There was an estate at Nerebus which produced quantities of it for the monastery at Derry. And I think it's very likely that this is one of the uses they would have put this material to. So the lords were great men in the Gaelic and the Irish world. Their status was way above anybody else. And one of the measures of that was their ability to feast and entertain other people and make gifts. And the hall was where this happened. Finlaggan was not occupied all the year round. It was a place where people came from all over the islands and elsewhere in Scotland for big events in the summer, for ceremonies to make new lords, for meetings of the council, for games, for trading, all sorts of things. And the main events for the main people took place in the hall. And there was probably a culture, even by our standards, where vast quantities of drink and food were consumed. And round about the hall, we discovered in our excavations extensive kitchens, food preparation areas, and very probably guest accommodation as well. That's what being a great lord was about. That's what the Great Hall was about. And we discovered various midden deposits on the island, admittedly a bit earlier than the 15th century, but from these midden deposits of the 13th century, we were getting evidence of the importation of wine, probably from the southwest of France, of cherries, of almonds, of nuts, of vast quantities of fish and meat that was eaten locally.
It's really amazing, this idea. I think it is such an important reminder how interconnected things were, sort of all the way from France, people importing things. I seem to remember you found a pilgrim badge from Rome, am I correct in thinking that came in some of the
Indeed, we did. We found a pilgrim badge from Rome. It's a medieval equivalent, if you like, of the I Love Rome T-shirt that people wear nowadays. But what's really important about it is that we have no documentary evidence which would have given us any clue that people would have gone in pilgrimage from this part of the world to Rome. But Rome was the only place that you could get a badge like this. And so it's quite important archaeological evidence for these wider links in the world in the medieval period.
It's absolutely amazing. Well, shall we go outside of the hall and head across the causeway, which in fact, I think there were quite a lot of interesting finds washed up near where the causeway was. But if we head out, so we're now leaving the main island and going out through onto the causeway up towards another island, the Council Island. This is sort of the islands we're going up towards really has sort of a story which relates to, I suppose, the political significance of Finlaggan. Andrew, would you like to say anything about that or about councils?
Well, the history of these councils and assemblies, of course, again, is one of these things that stretches back into the world before the lordship emerges, and we have good references to these sort of assemblies taking place in the kingdoms of the Isles that existed in the late 11th and in the 12th century. There is a reference in the Manx Chronicle to an assembly in the Isle of Man in the year 1237. And of course, that place name in the Isle of Man, Tynwald, the assembly place in the island, actually the form of the place name includes the Old Norse word for an assembly, which is a ting or a thing. And we can find that in other parts of the kingdom as well. So I think one of the things that's important here is to situate this tradition of councils and assemblies within that broader context. And it's interesting that in this particular case, it's situated on this smaller outlying island, Council Isle, and that can be paralleled in other parts of Britain, British Isles as well. So for example, in Shetland, a similar site. I don't know whether David or Alan would like to chip in some more there.
Well, I could say it's interesting that the first detail that we read of this particular assembly place comes, I believe, from the mid-16th century, from an account by a chap called Donald Munro, who undertook a little tour of the islands to produce an ethnography, if you like, with political undertones, documenting its peoples, their economies and their culture. And he tells us that this island, which is Eilean na Corla in Gaelic, Council Isle in English, was a place where traditionally the Council of the Lords of the Isles met, a group of 15 men. And what he's talking about by this stage are memories of an evaporating Gaelic tradition, but as Andrew has mentioned, there is evidence that it may have at least some roots tapping into an older Scandinavian tradition. And in addition to the various sites which name check the element think or assembly, there are other snippets of tradition and history throughout the Western Isles which point to the existence of some mysterious lawmen. The surname Lamont, not Lamont, as it's often translated for the purposes of the BBC, but Lamont probably derives from Old Norse lagmaður, which literally means lawman, but probably has a more specific meaning of the president or the chief officer of some kind of legislative council. So the site chosen for this particular assembly is also poignant because it's one that had been in use, possibly not continuously, but definitely with breaks, for many, many hundreds of years by the time the reconstruction we're looking at is based. So there is evidence that part of the Council Isle is built on top of an earlier Iron Age structure, a dry stone structure, which may in turn be built on an artificial island. And so this is it really is a centre of importance, which has an antecedence that goes back beyond what it's possible to know from the historical record and way back into the past.
Ian, absolutely. So Ian, could we fly up a bit so we can see the island in context? Yeah, so if we can try to see the Council Isle and Ellen More, yeah, and then also if we can look back towards the land and see it, the land. Yes, that's fantastic. That's brilliant. Thank you. David, you were about to say something. I do apologise.
Yes, I mean, I think it's perhaps worth saying that Council of the Isles, in a very real sense, this was a parliament as we would think of it. This was a body that could meet and make decisions about how things were going to be organised in the lordship. They could give judgments. And I think it's one of the measures, one of the indications of how the Lordship of the Isles under the MacDonalds was in fact a state in the making, that it was heading in a direction. They probably wanted to be independent, to be a separate kingdom, but in fact, they never quite got that far. But I think it's quite an important indication.
They have their inauguration ceremonies. There's a theory on a mound on the shore of the loch, the actual inauguration ceremonies.
Right. Well, of course, this is one of the other main traditions about Finlaggan, is that it was a place where lords of the Isles underwent inauguration ceremonies when they were created lords. We don't know for absolutely sure where these ceremonies took place at Finlaggan, but we think it was probably at a mound at the head of the loch, adjacent to the present Finlaggan Visitor Centre, which is run by the Finlaggan Trust. And we're told in 17th century accounts how there was a stone with a footprint in it. And when a new lord was about to be made lord, he stood with his foot in this footprint. And there were ceremonies which involved him being given a white robe, being given a sword used by his ancestors, being given a white robe, and generally being shown off to the people. And there was much feasting and dancing and various other ceremonies. Now, what's interesting about this is that this description ties in with the way that other kings were made in the Celtic world and right across Europe. A very obvious parallel to this, where there is also a mound, incidentally, is at Scone outside Perth, where kings of Scotland were inaugurated, underwent coronation ceremonies, if you like. And this is one of the things which makes Finlaggan a very important centre. And these traditions, again, very possibly go back a very, very long way into the past.
Well, I think that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And so there's the traditions, and obviously there's the efforts to interpret that and apply that to the sort of the slightly more concrete archaeological evidence that you found at Finlaggan. Now, one of the interesting things, of course, is Finlaggan is we've shown it in the 15th century, but actually it changed quite a lot over its history. And we were hearing about the island where the council met, perhaps having been sort of actually prehistoric structure at one point, sort of Crannog style thing. But in the Middle Ages, that part of Finlaggan actually changed a huge amount, didn't it? Could you maybe tell us about some of the sort of high medieval stuff that you found on that island, David, maybe?
Right, okay. Alan referred to the fact that it's an artificial island. It started off as a man-made structure, a crannog, and then there was a fort built on it. And over the top of that, perhaps in the late 12th or 13th century, a large stone keep was built. And perhaps Andrew can comment on this afterwards. But certainly in the 13th century, Finlaggan in many ways was a castle, very much in a European tradition, with a keep, and there was a chapel, and there was a fortified outer enclosure with a hall and various other buildings. And it was only really about the beginning of the 14th century that all changed. That castle, that keep were flattened, maybe dismantled, maybe there were structural problems. And it's only in the later 14th and 15th century that Finlaggan developed into a centre of a different type, a centre which didn't have fortifications, but which had this large feasting hall as a symbol of the greatness of the lords.
So we've maybe got a picture of sort of a castle, of maybe sort of giving us an idea of perhaps a little bit of the style that perhaps, would this be fair to say? that Finlaggan might have had this, am I correct in saying this is Castle Rushen we've got up on the screen at the moment?
That's right, yes. That's Castle Rushen on the Isle of Man. It's a good comparator for the structure that David's been talking about. In fact, I think David makes the point in one of his publications and specifically uses Castle Rushen as a comparator. Now, what you're looking at in the picture is a structure that is the result of many centuries of buildings and rebuildings. But at the core of that structure is a square stone tower or keep. The best dating suggestion for it right now is around 1200. There's no documentary evidence at all for the castle in that period. So they're working with archaeological and architectural evidence. And the best thinking is that this is from around 1200 in origin. And given the fact that this is the time when the Scottish Isles, including Islay, are very closely connected with the Isle of Man by virtue of the existence of those kingdoms. It's a good comparator.
It's fantastic. Now, of course, the Lords of the Isles do actually have castles. And Ian, I think we've got a video of one of their castles not so very far from Finlaggan, Danuvig Castle, quite near to a famous distillery. So while we're watching the video of one of the Lords, of one of the other castles of the Lords, why can people say a little bit more about what model Finlaggan was trying to follow when it moves away from this castle model and going for another vibe at Finlaggan? And why was that possible? Why didn't they have to have huge defences and things?
Right. Okay. Well, Danuvig obviously is a very strong castle with fortifications, and it withstood several sieges. But one of the interesting things about a lot of the main castles in the Western Isles is that they are what some people now call galley castles. They're places where you can pull up ships, and in the case of Danuvig, you can actually get the ships inside the castle. And a lot of the power of the lords, as we mentioned earlier on, was their ability to put warriors in ships, the successors of Viking longships, and send them across the seas to wage warfare. And there are a number of castles of that type and in the Western Isles. But in the case of the lords themselves, with their main base at a place like Finlaggan, what you've got to picture is a household with leading men, with officials, with a bodyguard of men, several hundred strong, with people who had to be put on in ships with several other people to actually pull the oars. This is a vast force of people that had to be moved around. And they weren't going to be put up in some little tower house in a typical Scottish model. They were going to move from a place like Finlaggan with its facilities, its great hall and its kitchens, and they were going to go to other major centres which similarly had large feasting halls like Arras on the island of Mull, on the Sound of Mull, or Ardtornish across the water in Morven, where there was plenty of scope for a large force like that. Or then to go up the Great Glen. In the Middle Ages, the Lords of the Isles also controlled the Great Glen all the way up to Inverness and Dingwall, and they could similarly take this vast force of men and officials and stay in Inverness or Dingwall. So in a way, it was the fact that the Lords had all these men, this power, this status, which meant they could live in open sites, whereas if you like, people a bit further down the social scale who were clan chiefs, who were nobles and lairds, still valued having tower houses or traditional type castles.
Absolutely. It's very interesting. I think we've got a picture of another sort of island site. I think it's so interesting that I think it's so important to remember that there are different models of important residents and different models of important sites, and that obviously the castle has achieved this sort of huge fame as sort of what we think of as the important medieval building, and specifically important medieval lordly residence. But it's so important to remember, and I think Finlaggan is such an important reminder, that there were different aspects. We've got a picture up on screen. Am I correct in thinking this is St. Patrick's Isle, which might be, again, another interesting comparison for Finlaggan in some ways?
Yes, that's right. It's St. Patrick's Isle, Peel Castle on St. Patrick's Isle on the west coast of the Isle of Man. And as you can see from the picture, it's situated on the small islet that lies a few hundred meters off the main island. It's connected now by a causeway, but in the medieval period, it was a tidal islet. And this was one of the power centers of the Manx rulers. And indeed, it remained a power center for some time after the Manx kingdom fell apart as well. And it's interesting in a couple of ways as a comparator, partly because obviously it's a power center situated on an islet, and partly because most of the structures that you can see there, particularly the very strong curtain wall that sort of follows the contour outline of the island, those are later medieval. Those are post Kingdom of the Isles. And there's some evidence for late Norse fortification on the lower part of the islet to the right-hand side of the image. But it's interesting in that it may not have been completely fortified in the earlier period. The obvious difference that we see with Finlaggan is that, of course, Finlaggan is situated in the loch, and it's not directly on the sea. And this is a very commanding situation overlooking a significant chunk of the Irish Sea towards Ireland. So it's interesting just to think about, you know, power centers situated on small islands that are located near or indeed within larger islands, I think.
No, absolutely. I think it's fascinating. And I think this question of sort of the importance of water, whether it's sort of in the relatively small scale landscape planning of what looks impressive, what seems symbolic for building your residence, but also, of course, we've got this world which is connected by the sea, a time where it's easier to travel by sea in some ways than it is over land. Ian, we've got a video, I think, of an archaeological remains which connect in to this maritime culture. And while we're watching the video, Alan, could you maybe tell us a bit more about the maritime culture of the Lordship of the Isles and the places that Islay was connected to?
Certainly. You made a very good point, as have the others, about the significance. And just to stress for the viewers, the listeners, whereas for us nowadays, these locations, they might seem remote and inaccessible. Actually, in the Middle Ages, and for centuries on either side of that, we know the sea functioned more as a motorway, as a superhighway. It was the medium for communication, not necessarily for ordinary people, but for the warlords with their fleets of warships and their huge numbers of troops in tow. I can tell you that as late as the 16th century, in 1569, for example, a chap called Sorley by MacDonald, who was the brother of James MacDonald of Danuvig and the Glens, he raised a fleet of 32 ships and assembled a force of 4,000 men in the Sound of Islay in preparation for an attack on Ireland, which was aborted at the last minute. But this is fairly typical of the records and the accounts of military gatherings that we read. So these were powerful people. Their power was based partly on their access to resources, but the main resource being soldiers, warriors, and ships. Now, to an extent, we have to assume that the lordship focus on sea power is a legacy of the Norse traditions of the Viking Age. And although we don't have any ships which have survived from that period, by looking at art historical evidence, by looking at images of the longships Berlin or Highland galleys, which are preserved on West Highland grave slabs, it can be taken pretty much for certain the Lords of the Isles were the descendants of Viking longships.
Yeah.
Now, when they weren't in service or when they were being assembled, obviously they would have to be stored or they would have to be put in suitable berthage. And Islay has got some very large-scale potential for berthing warships. We've got the extended natural harbour, which is provided by the Sound of Islay, which isn't really so far, maybe 10 kilometres or less from Finlaggan. But then if we go a bit further south, we come into the huge sheltered bay of Lochindaal. And I think on the screen there, although it's dulled down a bit, what we're looking at there is the north end of Lochindaal. We're looking at the beach at a place called Try and Lug. And possibly as it turns round and we spin towards having north at the top, you'll be able to see a strip of raised land under the surface of the water. That's not natural, at least not all of it. That appears to be the remains of an absolutely monumental pier for a harbour. Now, this is something which is only just to researchers in recent years. David's been instrumental in bringing it to light, but it ties in quite nicely with an account which is recorded in the late 18th century by a Welsh traveller, a man called Thomas Pennant, who went on a tour of the Hebrides. He spent quite some time in Islay, where he was shown antiquities, including Viking swords, but he also heard local stories about harbours where the Great MacDonald, which is a familiar name for the Lords of the Isles, kept his ships. And it was said that they were piers with huge doors attached to protect the shipping at this particular spot. And he said the evidence of this statement was in a huge iron hook, which had just been discovered. We believe that Pennant may have seen this hook, but none of us have, because it's been lost somewhere down the line. So the Lords of the Isles were in a position to raise huge fleets of ships. They were also in a position to secure them and make them safe. And this structure we can see here is a very visible remnant of that.
So we've got this potentially this Viking legacy in the maritime power and the style of the ships and things, and the networks and the places that they're connected have this Viking legacy. But the Vikings also left another legacy on Islay. Ian, do we have the map? Because Islay today, its place names are influenced by quite a lot of different cultures. And you've done, Alan, you've done a lot of research into the place names of Islay. Could you maybe tell us about the place names and the different cultures they represent?
Well, I'll make the proviso that the island of Islay lies at the heart of Gaelic culture, of Gaelic tradition. And actually, if you were to get a list of all the place names in Islay, the vast majority of them nowadays would be Gaelic. There's no doubt about that. But if you go back in time, if you go back through the records we have, and you focus on the names which were of central cultural importance, so the names of the farms, the names of the major settlements, the names of the major natural features, the further back in time we go, the higher the percentage of those which are not Gaelic, but which come from a Scandinavian linguistic background, it starts to rise. So the map you can see there, it's a very crude tool. This isn't based on an analysis of modern Islay. What you can see there is a map showing the outlines of the traditional Islay farm districts. And this is based on the survey of a chap called Stephen McDougall from the mid-18th century. And it's been colour-coded there to show you the farms and the area that's controlled by them, which have names from a Gaelic background. Those are the white ones. The very dark ones are either uncertain or unnamed or maybe Scots English. But the mid-tone there represent farms, traditional farm names, which are based ultimately on Old Norse word material. And you can see that these are spread over the whole island. And actually, if you look at the underlying geography and geology, you'll find they cover every type of land, from the best arable land to what we would consider unproductive scrubland. We cover a bit of everything. Now, something I think is very interesting is, we see these names all about, and round about the glen, so the central passageway between the Sound of Islay and Loch-in-Dal, of which Loch Finlagan lies very centrally, we can see that there is a big white patch of Gaelic names. And they're all very good Gaelic names. We've got Balachleving, Balacharivich, we've got Balol, Baluliv, Ballygrant. And you might be thinking that this maybe points to the continuity of a Celtic Gaelic tradition going back to time immemorial. But if we look carefully at the typology of these names, the elements that they contain, we can see they're actually relatively late. They probably cannot predate the later part of the Middle Ages. Before this point, the word Bala wasn't really used for place names in the same way it's been used since. We can also find that tellingly, Some of these Gaelic Bala names also contain personal names, which, although they've been adopted into Gaelic, probably come from an earlier layer of Old Norse tradition. So Bal Uliv, for example, the farm of Uliv, someone who, if the name had been given a couple of hundred years earlier, might have been known as Ulfr. Good Norse name, wolf. And the same with Balol. That probably derives ultimately from the personal name Olafur, Olaf. So that's interesting because it suggests that this cluster of Gaelic names round about the centre of the Lords of the Isles is relatively new. All round about this, we see very typical Scandinavian names. We see lots of names that end in the word bus or balls or bussig or bolsa. And this is a Norse word for farm, typically farms which have been divided up by a major landowner and doled out to their supporters. So round about Finlaggan, on the periphery of this Gaelic cluster, we've got lots of good Norse names like Toribus, possibly the farm of Thorir or the Turfy farm. We've got Persibus, the priest's farm. We've got Robles, Robusig, which is the farm maybe of the hillside that looks like an oar lock. And there are many, many more. I could go on for ages about this. If you're really interested, viewers,
Yeah, so go for it, though, please do.
you could have a look at my book, The Norse, The Vikings in Islay, and you could read a bit more about it there.
Exactly, it's so fascinating, and you've done such detailed work, which is it's so exciting to see what can be done with the place names. It's really, really fantastic. Thank you. I think it's so interesting the different forms of evidence which we're using to reconstruct a time period which maybe doesn't have totally simple historical records. Like there are some societies which have produced more documentation than perhaps the culture that was there on medieval Islay. But nonetheless, it's great to see with the work that Alan, that Andrew and that David, that all of you have been doing, nonetheless, there are a lot of ways to discover a lot about this time period. David, maybe you could tell us something about some of the objects that you excavated at Finlaggan. I think we've got a picture of one of them here, and maybe you could tell us a bit about it and what we can read into the culture from the objects you excavated.
Okay, can I just say that this object and some of the other best objects from the excavations are on display in the visitor centre at Finlaggan, which is maintained by the Finlaggan Trust. Essentially a splendid body of local people who over the years have done an enormous amount of work to bring Finlaggan to the fore, make it accessible to other people, and make it a really important place to visit. And I'm sure that people will be able to have seen from the presentation this afternoon that it really is a must-go-to place. And you'll be most welcome to go there. But this bronze object that you're seeing here, which is a mount with a swivel piece, which has got dragon heads on it, we found in the Midden deposits next to Aileen na Corley. And there were two identical mounts like this with various other little rivets. And we think that these are actually the mounts from a pair of dog collars, very high status dog collars. They're beautifully decorated, really quite splendid. And it's very rare in archaeology that you can actually get down to individual people. Normally what you're doing is you're excavating to get an impression of what life was like in say the 15th century, rather than homing in on a particular precise event or a particular person. But one of the things that I find really fascinating about these dog collar mounts is that there is a praise poem dating to the middle of the 13th century in honour of Angus Moore, the man who lived at Finlaggan. He was a big man in the Western world. He was credited with going around Ireland and raiding all the beaches there with the men of Islay. He took part in warfare there. He was one of the leaders, actually, of the Norwegian fleet that came down to attack Scotland in 1263. And his father was Donald. In other words, Angus Mor was the very first MacDonald. That's who he was. This praise poem to him, though, describes, among other things, how he inherited his hunting dogs and his dog leashes from his father, Donald. And I just wonder whether this is what we've actually found, the very pieces in question. If not, it doesn't really matter at one level, because there's still splendid pieces. And I think that they are really, to a large extent, what Finlaggan was about. It was a place where the lords went to hunt. Hunting was of immense importance amongst the ruling classes in Europe in the medieval period. It was a high status sport of kings and great men. And there's a very telling remark by Dean Monroe in 1549 when he's describing the meetings of the Council of the Isles, because what he says is that the council continued to meet even though the Lord was at his hunting. And I think that's a tremendous image. It just shows, and indeed we found other evidence in the excavations, arrowheads of a particular type that were used in hunting. So I think it really does actually get across quite a considerable message of what Finlaggan was about in terms of status and quality.
I mean, they're absolutely beautiful objects. We've got another really sort of aesthetically pleasing, I think, sort of a reminder of the really complex visual culture that there was at Finlaggan. And do we have the Finlaggan cross head, which has got an interesting story? We passed it in the reconstruction, didn't we? But if we can have a look at that. David, could you tell us a little bit about the Finlaggan cross and maybe some links there?
Yes, that's also one of our star finds. We found very early in our excavations, where it had been knocked off its shaft next to the plinth that it stood on outside the chapel. Now, this cross is local West Highland manufacture, probably of the 15th century. And you can find a number of these crosses throughout the Western Isles and the West Highlands. And it's very much a local tradition of commemorative crosses that go right back to the time of, the time of St. Columba, if you like. And there are numerous other crosses of much earlier age. And it's very much a sort of ongoing Christian tradition that people of high status put these crosses up. But the style of it is also really quite fascinating. It's a very hard rock that they're using, very difficult to carve, a local type of rock. But the form of the decoration, with its foliage, with its interlaced designs, and on other pieces with its little images of people, hunting scenes, of weapons, of armor, the very important record of a way of life which was distinctly different from the way of life in the rest of Scotland. Because I think that through this cultural tradition and in so many other different ways, the Lords of the Isles were positioning themselves as being apart from lowland or wider European culture. And a large part of that is this fantastic tradition of sculpture. There's something like about 900 examples of this sculpture, this type of sculpture of the medieval period, survive in churches and graveyards around the Western Isles. A remarkable tradition, much richer than you'll find elsewhere. And I think to some extent, how this was fueled was the tradition of local men of status serving as mercenaries in the wars in Ireland and elsewhere in Scotland, getting money and wanting to leave some commemoration or store up favour in heaven by doing something that appeared to be religious. They maybe didn't have access to getting married or settled down or getting land, but having fantastic grave monuments or commemorative crosses was a large part of it. And that to me is a fantastic part of what Finlaggan is all about. And that's beautifully displayed in the Finlaggan Visitor Centre.
It's a beautiful, beautiful object. And I think some things that comes through is sort of how many different cultures there are and how many different things interacting in all of this area. It's really, really exciting to see a sort of multicultural society that's sort of at this relatively early date, and a society where maybe the networks and where the places which are linked aren't exactly the same way that we think of the geographical links today. And it's so fascinating hearing all the different insights. So we've now, I think, got questions. I think Alan has been sort of moderating some questions coming in, so it's a chance for everyone to raise questions they'd like. So anyone, whether if you're part of the Zoom chat, do chip in and sort of ask, or if you're sending in questions on Facebook, we'll try and get to them and work our way through. So everyone ready for questions? Alan, do we have things lined up for the panel? I think this is Alan, my colleague.
Absolutely. Sorry, just demuting myself there. So that's great. So, and maybe with some apology for pronunciation, but Telialoa wanted to ask what you know about the presence of women during the council meetings. Did the wives attend?
Right. That is a very interesting question, and one that I've been thinking about quite a lot in recent time, because one of the intriguing things about so much of medieval culture, excavation of castles and other great houses, is being able to recognize the presence of women or children. And the honest thing to say is that when I look at literally the thousands of pieces of information and finds that we made in the excavations over 7 years at Finlaggan, it's practically impossible to recognize things which really do mean women. And that bothers me, because we know that women played a very important part in society at the time. Some women rose to remarkable status, even led armies into battle. And they were seen as tremendous political assets and very strong. And insofar as we failed as academics, archaeologists, to find much evidence for them, it seems to me that this is something that we've got to do an awful lot more work on.
That's great. Thank you very much for that answer to it. I mean, there's quite a lot of sort of discussion. I mean, one question was, will this be available later? Will the
yes,
video
it will be. You can view the video later online, can't you? On our we've got a series of videos from Heritage at Home which you can view on Facebook.
Okay. There's been some commentary. Somebody asked for the to post the link to the book, The Vikings in Islay, but that has been done. And yeah, so there's been lots of interest. I can tell you we've had record numbers of people viewing as well. So that's good. Oh, so for a question also from Natalie. Hi, Nat, in France. So it's good to get the international aspect. My question is about the sons of Alistair Ogg of Islay, the brother of Angus Ogg, who was defeated and killed, ? During the War of Independence. When Angus Ogg took Islay in the name of Robert the Bruce, he stole the place to Reginald, who was the first son of Alistair Ogg. So I wonder what happened to Angus Ogg's nephews. Were they murdered?
Well, it may be that they founded families in Ireland, Gallowglass families, families which settled there and offered mercenary services. The genealogy of the MacDonalds and other families in the Western Isles is a very complex business, where one's trying to juggle around names which are often repeat themselves and come up with some best fit. I don't pretend to be an expert in these things, but I'm sure the last word has not been written. on who a lot of these people were and where they went to.
Okay. Yeah, and there was some discussion about the Gallic pronunciation as well, and I think that it was said that that there's quite a lot of Gallic in the exhibit that's on the island. But I think we'll be able to post that up online later, I think.
Would Alan like say anything about the sort of role of Gaelic and Islay and perhaps Western Isles more generally, or?
Well, I could say a few words in general sense. I'm not a Gaelic expert. I'm a Scandinavicist, but I think it's fairly clear from the evidence that a Celtic language, the ancestor of Gaelic, was spoken in the Isles going back 1,500 years. Things get very complicated during the Viking Age. So for the west of Scotland, that means from about the end of the 8th century. And the reason they get complicated is, well, especially for Islay, for the following 200, 300 years, there are absolutely zero records of what was happening there. So we've got a huge black hole in our historical record. After the Viking Age, when Islay begins to crawl back into the light of history, it seems that several things have changed radically. So the kingdom or the polity of Dalriada has disappeared completely. The ancient lineages, which are said to have controlled it, are no longer there in the west. And all of a sudden, we have all these important farms and hill names and river names with Scandinavian words in them. How has this happened? And the people who are ruling the area are demonstrating traits that we would in other places associate with Scandinavian warlords. So there's been Scandinavians, which makes sense because the Western Isles of Scotland line the sea road between Norway and Dublin. This is the main route of transit from Western Scandinavia down to the Irish Sea. We know that Scandinavians were stopping off en route. This is crystal clear from what we know of the archaeology, the history, and the place names of Shetland, of Orkney. By the time you get down to Islay, it's routinely assumed that because it's so close to the centre of the Irish-speaking universe, that maybe things didn't change so much. And it's a possibility that in certain areas, things continued fairly much as they had done. But Islay is different. It's different even to some of the other bigger islands round about. Its location, as we've heard several times, is extremely important strategically. So it is the first or the last safe stopping point before the dangerous North Channel. It holds the key to the Irish Sea. Anyone coming from the north or travelling from the south has to go past. It's also very fertile. It's a suitable home for lords who aspire to be seen as great and generous. It's a fantastic series of natural harbours where big naval fleets can be assembled. So it stands to reason that Scandinavian warlords would have valued the island for exactly the same reason. And here's the thing about how life and society works in the Middle Ages. People tend to be very insular, very inward looking. They tend to not be educated in the sense that we are today. So they're not open necessarily to loving their neighbours or people who speak different languages because they are literally alien. They cannot be understood. And Scandinavians wanting to settle in Islay, they wouldn't get their phones out and swipe open Rightmove and find a house for sale. Property wasn't for sale in the way it is now. It was owned. Owning property was something that gave the elite their prestige status. If they gave landed property away, they risked losing their prestige status, which is not something they wanted to do. These wanted to be the people who could eat as much as they could, not the people who starved from one year to the next. So to cut a long story short, for Scandinavians to get a toehold on Islay, for Scandinavian place names to be implanted, we would need to have seen a substantial influx of powerful Scandinavians, and they wouldn't have settled for second best. They wouldn't have come unless they were powerful enough to take what they wanted and to protect it. So there are strong arguments, I feel, to be made for the acculturation of Islay and other places as far south through the Viking Age to make them more or less completely Scandinavian in outlook. And it's not really till the end of this period, until the brink of the period of the lordship and of the Kingdom of the Isles, when Gaelic becomes important again, because there are systemic changes in Norway. We see the success of Christianity imprinting itself on the conceptual framework of the place. Kings become Christian so they can control their kingdoms better. And they realise, well, maybe they've got most of what they need at home in Norway. Maybe they don't need to spend as much time commuting to the Isles and controlling them. And this leaves a bit of a vacuum. And of course, when Christianity comes to Islay, the kind that reaches there first will come from the neighbouring Gaelic-speaking areas. So with Gaelic being the language of the church, the language of the nobility on either side, in the Irish mainland and the Scottish mainland, it stands to reason it would gradually have gained prestige. And by the later Middle Ages, we see Gaelic being reintroduced, albeit in a later form, and being implanted as a layer on top of this Scandinavian settlement stratum. So the whole thing is very complex, but Gaelic is both ancient in Islay and it's an innovation. And somewhere in between, there is scope for a layer, a sedimentary layer of the Scandinavian language and a Scandinavian cultural experience. And that's what I've tried to get at in this book, The Vikings in Islay.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think we might be running out of time.
We are running out of time, Beth, but also, we're also getting hundreds of questions coming, coming in. So I don't know what to do.
Alan, do you want to sort of select a final question? Do you sort of a starring moment? Would that work?
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of questions here in the discussion, and I think what we can do is we can maybe look at that and come up with answers and post them in the discussion. I think the key thing that came out was about the feast. There was a question about what is it that they would have liked to have drunk, preferably.
Right, shall I answer that? Well, we have found in the Midden deposits around the islands little bits of quite fine quality pottery which come from the Saintonge region of France, Bordeaux. In other words, the sort of region that produced claret. And I think that's what these guys wanted to drink. I have this image of these alleged savages sitting in their deck chairs on the edge of on the veranda overlooking the loch with their big goblets full of claret and cracking walnuts and almonds. That was probably what these guys did and what they wanted to do. And then going back, there was a lot of, incidentally, they ate a lot of pork, a lot of pork, pig meat in the Middens as well. And of course, deer and fish, lots of fish.
That's a lovely note. It's just really be wrapping up the idea of people sitting, relaxing on Islay, which hopefully is something maybe many of us will be able to do at some point in not too distant future. In the meantime, there are a lot of different ways you can find out more about Islay's history. We've got the fantastic Islay Cultural Database that Alan McNiven has been working on with the University of Edinburgh, and that's available online. There's a lot of information about that. So that's the Islay Cultural Database, which is well worth a look at. You can, of course, virtually discover Finn Laggan. We've got videos up on Vimeo of what it looks like today, and also of its the brief clips of what it may look like in the 15th century. And of course, please do check out some of the great publications. We've got sort of David's fantastic Islay, the Land of the Lordship. We've got Andrew's The Kingdom of the Isles, and also we've got his exciting The Sea Kings, which is just coming out. And we've also, of course, got The Vikings in Islay as well from Alan McNiven. So we've got a fantastic range of things and ways you can find out more about Islay. And we can post all that in the chat here. So Thank you so much for joining us. Can I say massive thank you to David, Andrew and Alan for all you did. Thank you so much. Really appreciate this. And thank you to all the support we've had from Flanagan Trust, who've been so supportive of this and of our work. And if you're interested in discovering more about Scotland's history, heritage and archaeology, we do have another Heritage at Home coming up on the 12th of June, on the afternoon of 12th of June at 3 o'clock. And this time we'll be discussing somewhere on the East Coast. We'll be discussing medieval St Andrews. But for the time being, thank you so much for joining us and stay safe. Thank you.